There is a quiet discomfort that runs through almost every religious experience. The fear of doubt. From an early age, many people are taught that doubt is a threat. That questioning is a sign of spiritual weakness. That thinking too much can be dangerous. That true faith does not ask questions, it only accepts. Doubt comes to be treated as a moral failure. Something to be fixed quickly. Hidden. Confessed with guilt. An idea is created that the strong believer is the one who never hesitates, never questions, never enters into internal conflict. But this does not come from the Bible. It comes from fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of opening cracks. Fear that if people start asking too many questions, the whole system will collapse. That is why, in many environments, doubt is not welcomed, it is silenced. It is not listened to, it is spiritualized. This is a lack of prayer. This is an attack from the enemy. This is weakness. Doubt stops being a human process and becomes a spiritual problem. The result is predictable. People keep believing, but they stop thinking. They keep repeating, but they stop understanding. They keep practicing, but they no longer know exactly why. Faith remains externally intact, but internally it begins to empty. Because every belief that cannot be questioned is not being protected, it is being isolated. And isolation does not produce maturity. It produces fragility. When doubt is forbidden, it does not disappear. It just hides. It accumulates. And it grows in silence. Until one day it no longer fits. At that point, the shock is usually violent. Not because the person doubted, but because they never learned how to doubt in a healthy way. They never learned to ask without guilt. They never learned to confront ideas without feeling like they were betraying God. They never had space to separate faith from fear. It is important to say this clearly. Questioning is not the opposite of faith. Biblical faith never required intellectual shutdown. It never asked for the suspension of consciousness. It never depended on the prohibition of questions. What many traditions did was confuse faith with blind obedience, and blind obedience with safety. But safety built on silence is not solidity. It is postponement. It postpones conflict. It postpones crisis. It postpones collapse. Until life, inevitably, asks questions bigger than the ones the person was trained not to ask. When that happens, the problem is not doubt itself. The problem is that it arrives late, disorganized, without internal structure. It arrives as rupture, not as process. Maybe that is why so many people associate doubt with destruction. Not because doubting destroys faith, but because they were never allowed to doubt with depth, time, and honesty. Repressed doubt becomes a bomb. Processed doubt becomes a foundation. So before treating doubt as an enemy, it is worth facing a more uncomfortable question. What if the real risk was never doubting? What if the greatest danger was never truly thinking about what you believe? Because a faith that has never been questioned is not necessarily strong. It may simply be untouched. Many faith crises do not begin with sin, rebellion, or distance. They begin with inheritance. Many people never chose what they believe. They just received it. They received ready-made phrases. They received answers before they ever had questions. They received a complete spiritual language, with vocabulary, conclusions, and well-defined limits. They learned to repeat before learning to reflect. In this context, faith does not arise from conviction. It arises from habit. You believe because you always believed. You defend it because you were taught to defend it. You repeat it because everyone around you repeats it. And this works for a while. It works as long as life stays within expectations. As long as questions are small. As long as inherited answers still seem sufficient. The problem begins when reality demands something deeper. When pain does not fit into ready-made phrases. When silence does not fit into memorized verses. When experience collides with what was always presented as truth. At that moment, something becomes clear. Inherited beliefs were never tested. And what was never tested was never strengthened. It was only preserved. There is an important difference between received faith and owned faith. Received faith is comfortable. It saves effort. It offers immediate belonging. But it is also fragile, because when pressured, it cannot speak for itself. It depends on the surrounding structure. It depends on the environment. It depends on approval. When these things fail, faith collapses not because it was false, but because it was never truly yours. That is why so many people feel lost when they begin to question. They do not know what to hold on to. They do not know what to let go of. They do not know what to rebuild, because they never separated what they believe from what they merely learned to repeat. Faith becomes an automatic reflex, not a conscious decision. And here lies a delicate point. Questioning does not mean rejecting everything. It means examining. It means looking at what has always been there and asking for the first time, do I really believe this? Does this sustain my life? Does this still make sense when no one is watching? This process is uncomfortable because it breaks the illusion of easy certainty. It dismantles an identity built only on continuity. But it is also necessary, because a faith that has never been confronted, was never chosen. It was only maintained by inertia, and what is maintained only by habit does not survive when habit loses its force. That may be why so many people confuse questioning with drifting away. In reality, many are simply trying to do something they were never allowed to do. Think their own faith. Take responsibility for what they believe. Stop living spiritually on autopilot. Because in the end, there is a simple and uncomfortable truth. What was never questioned was also never chosen. And what was never chosen will hardly be sustained when it costs something. There is a quiet but very present idea that questioning is a sign of spiritual weakness, as if true faith were made only of absolute certainties, never tension, never internal conflict. But this idea does not come from the biblical text. It comes from the human fear of losing control. The Bible, from the beginning, does not hide questions. It records people who believe and, at the same time, struggle to understand. Job is the clearest example. He does not question God's existence. He questions the silence. He questions justice. He questions the reason for pain. Job speaks, argues, complains, confronts, and at no point does God silence him for asking. What bothers is not Job's question. It is the attempt of others to silence him with easy answers. The Psalms follow the same path. There is no artificial spirituality there. There is exposed anguish, declared fear, doubt written as prayer. How long? Why do you hide? Why do the wicked prosper? These are not the words of someone who lost faith. They are the words of someone who takes faith seriously enough to speak honestly. The disciples also rarely understood things at the right time. They walked with Jesus, heard his teachings, saw miracles, and still misunderstood almost everything. They asked what seemed obvious. They interpreted wrongly. They expected things that were never promised. Even so, they were not pushed away for it. Jesus does not build his relationship with them on perfect understanding, but on process. And Thomas may be the most misinterpreted case of all. He is not the apostle of unbelief. He is the apostle of honesty. Thomas does not pretend faith. He does not repeat what others said just to fit in. He assumes his difficulty and verbalizes his need. And Jesus does not humiliate him, does not exclude him, does not treat him as less spiritual. He responds. This reveals something fundamental. God is not threatened by sincere questions. The biblical text does not present a fragile God who needs to be protected from human questioning. It presents a God who relates to real people, full of doubts, internal conflicts, and limitations. The problem was never asking. The problem was always using ready-made answers to avoid the question. When someone says that faith does not question, what they are really saying is that they prefer safety over relationship, because questioning requires presence. It requires involvement. It requires continuing to speak even when there is no immediate answer. And the Bible shows repeatedly that God remains, even when silence stretches on. God's silence in the face of questions never meant disapproval. Many times, it meant maturation. It meant faith was leaving the surface and becoming conscious. Because a faith that withstands questions is stronger than a faith that depends on their silence. There is a silent cost to never questioning what you believe. It does not appear at the beginning. It does not hurt right away, but it accumulates. A faith that was never tested looks strong while everything is stable, while life stays within expectations, while there is no loss, deep frustration, or real shock. The problem is that this faith is fragile on the inside. It was built on repetition, not conviction, on habit, not choice, on fear of being wrong, not understanding. And every structure like that breaks at the first serious impact. When crisis comes early, there is still room for adjustment, to reformulate, to mature faith while it is still forming. But when crisis comes late, the damage is greater. Because the person does not collapse only under the pain of the moment. They collapse under everything at once. The answers that never came. The questions that were never asked. The feeling of having lived for years, sustaining something they never truly knew. That is why late crises are often devastating. They do not produce only doubt. They produce rupture. Those who never questioned gradually often abandon everything all at once. Not because the faith was false, but because it was too fragile to withstand reality. When doubt is ignored, it does not disappear. It accumulates in silence. It turns into internal tension, into constant discomfort, into something the person avoids facing directly, until one day it explodes. And when it explodes, it does not come as a question. It comes as total withdrawal, as cynicism, as complete denial. Ignored doubt returns as rupture. And this could be avoided. Not questioning does not preserve faith. Delaying questioning does not protect anyone. It only pushes conflict to a more fragile moment in life. Questioning early does not weaken faith. It strengthens it, because it turns inherited belief into personal conviction. It turns repeated phrases into real understanding. It turns automatic obedience into conscious relationship. The faith that survives is the faith that was examined, that was stretched, that passed through the discomfort of not knowing everything. That is why this kind of conversation matters. Not because it delivers ready-made answers, but because it creates space for honest questions, before they turn into silent abandonment. If this theme resonates with you, if you have felt this internal discomfort at some point, it is worth staying close, not as a number, not as an obligation, but because content like this does not work in isolation. It is built with continuity, depth, and with people willing to think together. Subscribing is not about supporting a channel. It is about not going through this process alone. Because fragile faith breaks on impact. Questioned faith learns to endure. And the real risk was never doubting. It was never stopping to ask. There is a deeply mistaken idea that has been taught for a long time. That questioning weakens faith. As if true faith were the kind that never hesitates, never strains, never looks at its own limits. But that is not mature faith. It is emotional dependence disguised as devotion. Questioning does not destroy faith. Questioning refines it. It removes excess. It strips away illusion. It exposes what was sustained only by fear, habit, or repetition. Every faith that has never been confronted carries impurities. Unrealistic expectations, promises that were never made, ideas about God born more from human discourse than real relationship. Adult faith understands this. It does not flee from tension. It endures tension. It understands that trusting is not the same as controlling, that believing is not the same as having all the answers, that silence is not abandonment. Childish faith demands constant guarantees, demands signs all the time, demands that God function according to predictable rules. Adult faith does not. It remains even when it does not understand. It continues even when it does not feel. It sustains relationship without bargaining. And this is only possible when someone has had the courage to question. Because those who never questioned live trying to protect their belief. Those who question learn how to sustain it. God does not demand blindness. He demands honesty. The Bible never presented faith as the absence of thought, but as deep commitment even in the midst of uncertainty. The faith God sustains is not the fragile faith that breaks in doubt. It is the faith that passes through doubt without dissolving. That is why when someone begins to question, it is not a sign of falling. It is a sign of transition. It is the moment when faith stops being inherited and begins to be assumed. It stops being repetition and becomes choice. It stops being discourse and becomes relationship. This process is frightening because it dismantles old structures, but it also liberates. It frees from guilt for thinking. It frees from the fear of asking. It frees from the obligation to pretend certainty where only silence exists. Questioning does not kill faith. It kills only the fragile faith that would not survive reality. What is born after that is not perfect faith. It is real faith. Less loud, less anxious, less dependent on constant proof, but firmer, more honest, more conscious. Maybe what you are living is not loss. Maybe it is maturation. Maybe your faith is not dying. Maybe it is, finally, beginning.